Pest and Predator Podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator Podcast, brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. I'm your host, Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com. Today's guest is Jennifer Otani. She's the pest management biologist and coordinator for the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. She's at the Beaverlodge Research Farm for AAFC. Okay, Jennifer, today on the Pest and Predator Podcast, we're going to talk about surveys in the field. And this is really kind of a starting point for a lot of the extension and education work that growers receive throughout the winter months as well as the growing season. An important topic. So let's connect some dots here right off the top. We've been doing Pest and Predator podcasts for quite some time, talking about a number of pests we're trying to rid ourselves of, and obviously some of the beneficials that are doing that free work for us. When we think about surveys, what does that have to do with pests and predators? Connect some dots for us.
Yeah. Okay. So, Sean, we've been really fortunate. In our research program up in the Peace River region, we've been conducting lots of field work in commercial fields, but probably our most important and longest running work would be our annual Peace Canola Survey. So we've been doing this. 2023 was our 20th year anniversary, so to speak. But we've been monitoring canola fields for that entire period. It's an annual one-time look at what insects are in the crops. And so this all ties back to, all of our research work, but really surveys start to validate and start to corroborate what's actually there for diversity. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about surveys, in particular ours, is that we've been looking at, it started out as a pest survey, I won't lie. Our biggest problem in the Peace historically has always been lygus bugs. So that was a big priority for us to be monitoring. But at that point, when we first started in 2003, we were also very concerned about the cabbage seed pod weevil, whether it would move north, whether it would establish, and could we detect it and hopefully help our producers prepare for it. So that was a big impetus. It's a very pest-driven survey at the start. But now, particularly over the last 13 years, we've enhanced the capacity with our technical team here at Beaverlodge so that we're actually doing a full arthropod biodiversity study. And that is to say that what we're collecting in our sweep nets is not just pest counts. It's not just one species. We now have the capacity to look at a broad swath of all of the insects that are in those sweep net samples. And it's really starting to give us a better idea of the diversity of the various arthropods that are there, but also some of our beneficials. We're starting to get a better sense of those populations and how they maybe start to fit together with our pest populations. So it's turning out to be a very important tool for us to look at the diversity. I guess the other thing really important to remember with surveys in particular is that these are baseline data points from which change can be measured. If you don't look, you'll never have a problem because you can't compare to anything. Well, so too with our surveys, and in particular in the piece where we know that climate change is going to maybe have quite an impact over a fairly near time period. We need this data so that we can start to measure changes in cropping practices, changing pest populations, looking at some of our beneficials and how they're reacting, but also just being prepared for the future and measuring how much change occurs as we continue to adapt.
So do the surveys, do they drive the research priorities based on what you're finding, or as you put it, they're sort of a verification for some of the research that's already been done? Talk about that relationship.
Yeah, so those are really good questions because it works on both ends. So a lot of the field plot research work that I did at the very beginning was establishing populations, looking at changes when we were applying insecticides, for example. How do those populations of pests change? Well, now we have enough data from some of our surveying to actually see some of those changes after or when insecticides are needed. And we're starting to see how over long periods of time, both the canola production system is influencing the insects that are there, but also just how management is and pest use is having maybe a bigger impact. And when I say that, in the Peace River region, it's almost, we're very fortunate because some of our producers haven't had to rely on insecticides to the same degree that other parts of the prairies have. You know, we have fewer insects, but we're starting to look at the diversity and starting to hopefully understand what is a normal canola field looking like and how will it change from year to year? How does it change from one type of growing season to maybe the extreme? Like, for example, when we had that heat dome. So it's allowing us to start to look at the data sets, look at change, but also we can actually use some of that data to build models that we currently use to predict some of our insects. But even models need to be validated. And so that's why the surveys are so important. They really are a validation. They're a ground truthing of what's actually existing in our growing region. And it's also allowing us to measure what kind of changes are occurring over time. And that becomes kind of important because actually, Sean, in my short career of 25 years, our program has actually documented 6 new species that have had an economic impact in agriculture in the region. You know, 6 species, that's really incredible, even to me. And we're very much thinking that that's going to just continue to change. We have more globalization. We're going to see a few more crops maybe come into the region in the future. The heat, the drier conditions, or maybe it's going to be more wet. You know, is our growing season going to actually increase with frost-free days? All of these things are going to have an impact. And again, measuring that change is really important. And that's where the survey data annually really makes a difference.
So we've been doing it for 20 years, though. Can we, those are some new questions you've presented. Can we not just go back and look at old samples or old data and work our way forward? Like, why do we need to continue to collect the data?
Yeah, so that is a super question. And it's one that it would be nice if we were done. But as you well appreciate, agriculture continues to evolve and change. And our growing region continues to adapt. Really, all of Western Canada is going to change continually. So, what we saw for one chunk of period is really important. It helps us start to predict maybe what will start to happen, but no 2 seasons are ever identical. And I think one thing that we have to remember is when we get new species, like let's talk about Southern Alberta before they had cabbage seed pod weevil, and now what they have with cabbage seed pod weevil well established. That's why change and continual monitoring is so important. When you have huge changes and have different influences in agriculture, nothing is ever the same then. So some of the data that we're collecting, we continue to evolve. And really, I'll be very honest, when we first started to do the surveying, it was me and a summer student. We could do only 70 sites per year. That was a big undertaking for 2 people. Now we're at about 103 up to 140. Or at peak, we've been able to do 190 sites in a year. That gives us a much better look at what's happening. And for that reason, the sample size, the changes over time, changes in agriculture, all of these things really require a really close look. And we know that there will be new species to deal with. It's happened within my career and it will continue to happen. And so producers need to be aware, need to be on top of what potential risk is there. And we as researchers are needing to have a good grip and start to develop research to be proactive rather than reactive. And that's why surveys, again, are so, so important.
Yeah. And the number of samples I could see how that'd be very, very important, especially with the size of the geography of the Peace region as you're talking about. There's more acres in the Peace region of Alberta than there is in all of Manitoba from an arable standpoint, right? We're talking about a big area. Yep. And so the thinner that the number of samples gets, the less I guess the accuracy of the output on the other end. It's really important here for people to continue to participate going forward, because a sample drop is a problem.
Exactly. So one of the big things I'm hoping to communicate today is that all of us, whether we're federal, provincial, even our regional, county, field people who are active in insect monitoring, all of us need your support as growers, because we are depending on permission to access now. And it's very important. First of all, we want to have producers involved in knowing what's going on and being aware of the need. But more importantly, we really do want to make sure that we have the sample size, because as you just pointed out, we know there's geospatial variation, okay? What happens in one field doesn't happen identically in this field right beside it, or even 20 kilometers away. And so this is where surveying needs a certain number of samples collected over a certain geographic area so that we can actually start to report the variability, but more importantly, start to look at a broader set of data that better represents the region. And so when we're taking a look at some of these sites, one of the things that we're seeing over time is that we can do more sites, but now when we have the formalized permission to access system that we're now using, it's a little bit harder manpower-wise to get the permissions in place so that we can maintain a good, comprehensive look at more fields in the region rather than less. And again, it's going to be a question of detection. We're looking in some cases for very common insects, so you don't necessarily need to sample every field. But what we're most worried about is detection. And when you detect populations, they're usually, first of all, starting out to be quite small. And to be honest, you really have to look hard to find small populations that can be spaced very thinly. So this is where the detection and the sample size really factors in. When we started first to look for wheat midge, we tried for years ahead of when the actual outbreaks occurred in the Peace River region. For years, we tried to look, and we surmised the fact that the populations were so small and our ability to survey only a handful of sites, it just didn't allow us to detect them. And so, when we're talking about some of these new invasive species that could have a real economic impact, I would think as a grower, it would be helpful to know sooner rather than later. The worst case scenario is dealing with an outbreak. It's much easier for us to start to detect and start to be proactive, start to look at developing monitoring and management tools before you have a crisis.
Yeah, the proactive versus the reactive, and the impact here being at the end of the day hurting growers' bottom lines, right? So that's the preventative side of this, is trying to prevent that. Now, I got to ask you though. I'm really curious. I could think of reasons, but you're the one talking to some of the cooperators. Why would somebody? You've really done a good job of selling this and the benefits and the positives and the why. I congratulate you. Good job.
Right.
Why would somebody say no then? What's the issue? What's the barrier?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think sometimes it's not even that we're being told no. I think for many producers, some of them may not even realize that we need the permission in place. Others may not even realize how much surveying needs to take place and what different aspects of agriculture we're trying to protect by doing it. So it may just be an awareness issue that they don't necessarily realize that we need their help. So if anything, we're hoping that individuals who are willing, who are interested, and maybe now aware of it, that they will reach out to provincial people or federal people like me and say, hey, we are interested. How can we help and where can we sign up? Now, there are a few people that also are not willing, and we also fully understand that. Some of them are uncomfortable with allowing people onto their land. They feel uncomfortable with the notion. But I guess those are individuals that we are really hoping to talk to more so that we can explain, first of all, what we're doing, how important it is, and also making sure that they understand some of the really strict biosanitation all of us are using to protect their land in the first place. We are not the people who are going to be running into a field and causing a bunch of damage. We are the people that you want to respond to the damage before the damage is happening. And in that case, we are trying to implement some very sound scientific protocols that have good sampling methods that start to give us real data that would help growers in the long term.
You mentioned the diversity inside the canopy and looking at biodiversity now, and not just insect populations and things like that. How much diversity is there out there? Like when we look at this, is canola more diverse under that canopy than other crops, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, so our annual Canola Survey, we really focus on the canopy, and we do so by using a really cost-effective sampling method. It's the good old sweep net, okay? When we first started, we really focused on the pest populations. As I said, our focus was on lygus and detecting cabbage seed pod weevil. When we go through those samples, though, there is a wealth of knowledge. So we're typically doing 50 sweeps in canola. We empty that bag back in the lab after it's frozen, and we start to go through it. What has continued to stun me is that the diversity there is really astonishing. Even now, after all these years of doing the field work, we probably don't know what a third of that is really doing. And when I say that, we're now up to about 160 some taxon units. The majority of that is to species level, Sean. So we can tell you how many individuals of this species there are. But there's also a lot of material in that canopy for which identifying it down to species level is very difficult. It takes a lot of technical know-how. We're very fortunate because we're able to access taxonomic experts through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada who are based at Ottawa with the Canadian National Collection and the National Identification System. And those individuals help us identify things to species. But for the most part, some of this material is just so difficult to work with. Some stuff doesn't even have finalized keys for it for diagnostic purposes because there's still science being done in these groups. So some of these samples are super valuable to some of our colleagues too. But when we're talking about 164, essentially we think they might even be species. It starts to give you a really good look at, like, wow, there's a lot going on in the canopy. Now, not every field has that broad diversity, okay? It's interesting because over the years, we can also tell which fields have been sprayed. Yeah, because we have bags that come in that are empty, and they will be empty for a few weeks. The great thing about insects, though, is that they are able to move, so it's fortunately not a permanent thing. But really, we're getting a better insight into what is going on, trying to put names onto things, and then also trying to understand how it all fits together. And to be very honest, my dream for this data set is that it would be something or a tool that we could start to use to develop dynamic thresholds for insect pest management.
Okay.
Because
so
we have that
define
information with pests, and we have the number of pollinators, predators, parasitoids, and looking at, in that snapshot, what kind of populations are there? Do we think that that's going to be a normal canola field? Is that what a healthy field would look like? You know, these are the indicators that help us point to, okay, maybe these are the key species we need to be keeping track of more closely in order for us to build more dynamic thresholds that account for beneficial insects versus the pests. You know, what will that start to look like? That's really hard data to figure out, mostly because, Sean, we don't always fully understand how these different insect species interact with one another, let alone how they're interacting with our host crop. So there's still a lot of question marks out there. But what our survey is hoping to do is to really identify these are the species involved. These are the species we find every year. And these are species where we find really potentially damaging pest populations. And how does that differ with what seems to be a low pest population? So that's the dream for the data in the long run, and that's the ultimate goal, is to really understand better how all of these pieces interact and fit together.
So,
but it takes time.
yeah, well, yeah, in math, that's way over my head. We talk about dynamic thresholds. So, good luck to all
Yeah,
the computer science people out there. The when we look at this in dynamic thresholds and factoring beneficials into all of this, what beneficials are common in canola that we've been finding in the surveys, and of course they're beneficial, so we want to help them out, we want to enable them, we want to they're working for us for free, so to speak. So what do we do?
exactly. So, we broadly have started to group these species and families together into groups so that we can kind of manage and start to look at that data just on a surface scale, if you will. We're very much categorizing parasitoids together. So these are some of those parasitoid wasps that were particularly associated with some of our pest species. So things like wasps that would attack our diamondback, or some of the wasps that would attack Bertha armyworm. We find some of these general parasitoids, but we're also seeing some very specific ones. One super cool thing that we found with this canola survey quite early on is we saw this huge outbreak of wheat midge. Okay. And you're like, why are you talking about wheat, Jennifer? Well, what we saw underneath the canola that was standing on wheat stubble, we saw Macrogleanes penetrans emerging like crazy in canola. And it was a really interesting observation that has really led us to communicate clearly to growers. You've got to manage your stubble, because these parasitoids, even though you're growing canola, your parasitoids to manage wheat midge in the adjacent field are all coming out at this stage. So that's been one really important thing that has come out of this canola survey that we probably would not have necessarily seen had we done just strict field plot work. When we talk about some of the predators too, now the canopy has damselbugs, ladybird beetles. There's just a whole array of species. In fact, there's almost like maybe 25 different species that can be in some of our canola that would actively feed on ligas and some of the other insect pests. And when we talk about predators, the great thing is sometimes they're pretty broad in what they like to eat. So not only are they managing ligas, they're maybe managing some of the aphids that will show up. And of course, then we also talk about our pollinators. We talk about pollinators. The canola and the way that we're monitoring is not the ideal way to manage or monitor or assess pollinator populations. But what we do know is, of course, there are honeybees. But in our far north areas around Fort Vermilion and La Crete, there are some very unusual leafcutter bees that we just don't seem to see in some other parts of the piece, let alone other parts of the prairies. So some very unique parasitoids, pollinators are active in some of these less, well, I shouldn't say less, they're more remote, but yet they're highly productive areas. And so this is also why we're so keen to continue the surveying, because we know some of those areas really to the far north could change quite a bit as agriculture changes with climate, right? So I don't know if I answered your question super well, but the thing that I do really want to emphasize is from the sweep net sampling we've done, we estimate that maybe only about 3% of the species that are in that sweep net would be considered pests. At most, maybe it's about 15% of the actual quantity of insects that would be pests. There is a lot going on in your canola field, and we're really just scratching the surface in terms of understanding how all of those species are making canola really productive. And we do really feel that there is more to it than just honeybees and managing a few insect pests.
Can all of the interaction of all of those in the canopy help the price go up? Can they work on that?
I don't know if they can control price, but I will tell you this. Some of the numbers that we've found for flies that we think are actually functioning as pollinators, I'm beginning to now feel that that group is a broad group, right? But in terms of their pollination services, I think they've been grossly underestimated. We look to honeybees and lots of our other bee species for their pollination. It's well known, right? But some of these other groups could be having a far bigger role than we maybe appreciate. And I think more than anything, we're hoping that producers will start to understand that that diversity is good. When we see some of these sweep net samples coming in with, like, I'm not kidding, 15 insects in 50 sweeps, you're not getting all of those various interactions happening in that canopy.
You got like I said, you sold me here. A lot of the audience is keenly interested to listen to this podcast. We've got beneficial insects. We've got a beneficial survey work to be done. What do people need to do? How can they help? What's the call to action?
Yeah. All right. So I think what we're most concerned about is, I'm going to be very self-serving here, Sean. The PEST Canola Survey is near and dear to my heart. We've done 20 years. We would very much like to see it continue. We are hoping and trying to share a QR code that would allow producers who are willing to help us to supply us with their name and a phone number. And we want to start there. Call these folks back, get some field information, talk to them about the surveys that we need to do, and even some of our weekly field monitoring that we undertake every year. We need to make contact with these individuals and hopefully set up those permission to access forms, and we're hoping these folks will sign and allow us to continue this work. Up until now, the survey has been very random. We've been able to work with a number of different people, but there also has been some randomness to it. Now we are taking the permission to access very, very, very seriously. First of all, we want everyone in the region to participate, but by doing that, by giving their name and their number, it helps us get in contact with them. I also want to speak for all of my colleagues too, whether it's federal or our provincial folks too. Alberta Agriculture and their Alberta Insect Surveillance Unit also similarly needs that permission, and they are busy trying to spread a QR code or emailing. I think the main thing is, as a producer, if you're keen, please reach out even to your commodity groups to let them know that you're interested, because we are actually probably going to need help from the commodity groups too to make contact with more growers so that they have an opportunity, first of all, to understand what we're doing, to hopefully continue and support us by allowing us to gain access. Whether it's entomology or pathology or weed science, those are the three main areas where surveys really form critical databases from which we try to help producers. I also really do want to emphasize too, we want to keep our Canadian producers protected. We want them to be informed with risk so that they can manage things properly. We're also informing the agri-industry so that products can be available when and if they are needed. And then, making sure that our producers are as productive and have the best information possible, that is our key responsibility. And we can only do that by being their eyes and ears and being able to look with our lenses to see what the fine detail.
Awesome stuff. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Pest and Predator Podcast.
Thanks so much, Sean.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator Podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.